Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first bonus day of EmberConf. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Leah. How are you?
Nice to see you. I'm doing well. I'm Leah. I'm one of the organizers of EmberConf, and Julia is our wonderful MC for the third year running.
Third
Fourth?
year.
I'm losing track of time. And like some years before, we have so much content, and we just didn't want to smush it all into one like super jam-packed day, even though there is still a super jam-packed day. So we let some of it sneak out onto other days, so you could have a Friday and Monday bonus dose of EmberConf.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you excited?
I'm so excited. We're going to be discussing stuff in the Ember.js Discord, so make sure to join us there.
Yeah. So a couple of things to point out about how things are working this year. Today's content, totally free to everybody. Monday's content, totally free to anybody. It's a secret, evil, illicit strategy to make you buy a ticket to Tuesday. I'm joking, not that secret, not that evil. But for those of you who do have tickets to the full conference, we will be in Discord. There'll be some like live audio content that accompanies all the sessions today and Monday and Tuesday. That is the day that comes after Monday often. And some other stuff. You'll get a lot of details via that, about that via email, and also on Eventbrite when you log in, there's like a page for the event that you'll be able to see links and details to everything you need. But even if you're not coming to the conference on Tuesday, we're super glad to have you. And today is going to be wonderful. Right? Yes?
Yes, we have two talks today. We have a great talk from Kara Luton and also one from Jai Bhagat.
Yeah, and Kara's been a speaker at EmberConf before. Jai is new. Kara gave a talk 2 years ago about being a career switcher. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it yet, her past career was her being a ballerina, which like is just actually badass. I know, like as a little girl, people would always say like, "Oh, ballerina, twirl, dancing, blah blah blah," but like it is hardcore and it is hard work and it is competitive and it is physical and you need to like apply yourself and your toes bleed and
You
like
need to be a machine.
so don't be fooled. Don't take a minute when you hear the word ballerina to remember that that means this person's basically a badass. But like that talk, Kara's talk is going to have a lot of content that isn't necessarily Ember specific, though I'm sure Ember will come up, obviously. Welcome to EmberConf. So if you have friends who are not Ember developers, but who you think could benefit from learning a little bit about how to submit fantastic pull requests, then Kara's talk is for you and you should stick around. It is up first today. After is when we hear from Jai. He's going to talk about element modifiers, and it's his first time at EmberConf, so be nice to him. Yay, congratulations. And yeah.
I'm super excited for the modifier deep dive because working with Ember, that's like a new frontier for me. So
it doesn't get much more exciting than element modifiers.
Yeah, it's true.
Cool. Yeah. So we just wanted to welcome you all to today's broadcast. We will hopefully see you again tomorrow and then, well, not tomorrow, have a nice weekend, but Monday and then Tuesday. You'll see mostly lots of Julia, and I'll be popping in here and there, and then we'll both be on the Discord live audio show that will air in between the breaks on conference days with a ton of special guests and wonderful stuff. Yay. So with that, I think we're ready to hand it over to Kara. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. Enjoy, everybody. We will talk to you soon.
Bye.
I don't know about you, but I love the feeling of getting to hit the merge button on my pull request and sending it off to production. That's the ultimate goal as a software engineer, right? To get our code out into the world on prod. However, unless you're living life on the edge, there's a big hurdle you have to overcome before getting to push that merge button: getting approvals on our pull request. Before we dive in, I want to give y'all a little background on myself. I'm Kara. I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have 2 adorable dogs, Maggie and Franklin. Before tech, I pursued a career as a ballerina, and then I worked as a music publicist. But in 2016, I enrolled in a front-end engineering bootcamp, and I've been in tech ever since. And I'll do a little plug here. I spoke about my career journey and why non-traditional developers are amazing at EmberConf in 2020, so you should go and check that out on YouTube. Now I work as a user interface engineer at CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity company aiming to stop breaches. And as a UI engineer, I write and look at a lot of pull requests, and I've seen both good and bad PRs. But what even makes a pull request good? Let's take a look at this totally real PR. This is not a good pull request, but why? First, glancing at the title doesn't really give you an idea of what happened in this PR, other than some things were fixed and some other things were added. But that's okay. Let's take a look at the description. We're told a little bit more information about what has gone on here. A component and some mock data were added. But we're given no instructions on where we can even find this new component in the UI or how to test it. Last but not least, even though this seems like a pretty straightforward change, seeing over 1,300 change lines of code would imply otherwise. As a reviewer looking at this pull request, we really have nothing to go off of and are left in the dark. And the sad part of this is that, unfortunately, I've seen pull requests that look exactly like this. And in the long run, you're only making the PR process longer for your reviewers by not taking the time and effort to put a little bit more description into your PR. Pull requests are telling the story of your changes. They're a conversation between you and your reviewers. And as the author of that story, you want to make sure the process of reviewing your pull request is as easy as possible. It's vital that our PRs give everything to our reviewers that they may need. They should concisely describe our motives and thoughts behind our changes, all the while preemptively answering any questions our reviewers may have. Just like a good story, our pull request should begin with an outline of its chapters. In our case, our chapters are commits. We've all seen commit messages that provide absolutely no insight into what has gone on, but each commit message should show a progression in your pull request story. The subject line of your commit should give an overview of the changes that were made, while the body should provide additional context like why you made that decision, any possible future implications, and then a reference to the ticket or issue number. Using conventional commits can help provide even more at-a-glance insight. This is where the commit subject line includes various prefixes that follow semantic versioning. You can use for feature or fix, but it can also include items like test, chore, or style. Here's a great example of a descriptive commit message from the Ember core repo. The subject line, update error message instructions, is easily understandable. The author could have left the commit at that, but they went into further detail in the body of the commit message, explaining why that change needed to be made. Now anyone looking at this commit gets the full story of what was happening. Having explicit commit messages is important, but in order for your story to be understood, they need to be organized in a way that makes sense. It'd be extremely confusing to someone if a book had chapter 2 before chapter 1. You'd have no idea what was going on. You want to make sure that your reviewers can easily follow the story you're telling about your changes. And you're probably sitting there saying, Kara, well, I may have a fix that I need to implement later when I'm writing my code, or what if I need to refactor something? That's totally okay. The great thing is that as developers, we have the power to rewrite history with rebasing. If you aren't familiar with rebasing, it allows you to rework your commits. You can change the order, rewrite your commit messages, or even squash 2 or more commits together. Your commit history can go from something that looks like this, jumping around from implementing new components to adding mock data and PR fixes, to something like this that is much easier for anyone looking at your code to follow. This history gives a clear outline of what has occurred in each commit. It shows a clear path the developer was taking. You can see that one-off commits like fixing the form and applying feedback from the review were squashed into the commits where those changes make sense. Now looking at the commit history, reviewers are able to easily follow the author's development process, and anyone looking at this in the future can easily dive in and know what to expect on each commit. If our commits are the chapters to our pull request, then our actual code implementations and changes are the story itself. And it's important that we pay attention to the size of our story. There's a computer programming principle called the single responsibility principle. It states that every module, class, or function in computer programming should have responsibility over a single part of that program's functionality, and it should encapsulate that part. All of that module, class, or function services should be narrowly aligned with that responsibility. It's basically stating that a single module, class, or function should only focus on one thing. It should only have one responsibility. This same concept applies to pull requests. You would think that a PR that touches a lot of files would receive more comments than a smaller PR, but a study of a Cisco systems programming team revealed that developers who review no more than 200 to 400 lines of code at a time. Beyond 400 lines of code, the ability to find defects diminishes. So by breaking a larger pull request into several smaller ones, you're actually increasing the chance that you'll receive feedback and the potential for your reviewers to catch a bug that may have been overlooked. Here is a great example of keeping a pull request small from the Ember Learning team. An issue was created to fix some of the API links in the guides. The catch was that this needed to happen in the docs for multiple versions. The developer that took on this task created a single PR request for each version where the links were updated. They easily could have made this one PR, although it would have been pretty large with a lot of file changes. But by opening one pull request per version, they're enabling the reviewers to easily be able to parse the changes and look for any issues or missed spots. Breaking down a pull request sounds straightforward, but it can definitely sometimes be daunting. How do we know when a pull request is getting too big and should be separated? So say you're starting a new project on your team, and that includes generating a lot of boilerplate code. That starting code should be its own pull request. This is because you'll be adding a lot of files at once, and you'll want your reviewers to be able to look through each of those files to make sure that everything that is needed is included. After generating all of that boilerplate code, now it's time to start on the index page for that project and generate some mock data. That work can be separated into its own pull request as well. By having each pull request concentrated on a singular task, you're allowing your reviewers to focus on one thing at a time. They're not getting bogged down trying to put together the pieces of what's really going on with a million files changed. So we've covered the chapters to our PR story and the story itself. But what's a good story without an introduction? That's where our title and description come in. A pull request title is the first bit of information you're providing to your reviewers for what they're about to look at. It needs to give a concise overview of what is happening in the PR. One of the most common mistakes I see is using the last commit message as the title of your pull request. But this is only giving a brief peek into your story and not explaining the entirety of your changes. Here you can see two great examples again from the Ember Learning team. The first example, use CSS instead of utility classes from ESNote to allow HTML to be backwards compatible. It's to the point explaining what changed and even gives a quick explanation of why. The second example, upgrade to latest Ember and make 3.16 the lowest supported version, does this as well. You're even alerted to the fact that this pull request is going to contain a breaking change, which is extremely important information that reviewers need to know upfront. The description is where you can provide even more detail for your reviewers or anyone looking at your pull request in the future. Something important to keep in mind when writing your description is that you shouldn't assume the reader's prior knowledge of the area of the code base you're working in. It is your job as the author to provide that context to them. You can do this through including information on the what, why, and how of your changes. What changes were made, why you made those changes, and how the reviewer should test them. The what should provide explicit details on the changes in your pull request. Remember how our commits are the outline of our story? Well, this is where that outline comes into play. Use your commit messages as a baseline for explaining your changes to your reviewers. Expand on what you previously wrote with a bit more detail. This section of your description should also include any lingering to-dos linked to their follow-up ticket. Remember that you want to cover all of your bases in your pull request, so it's important to provide the context of what has happened or has not yet happened within your pull request to your reviewers. The why section of your PR explains the reasoning behind your changes, including any architectural decisions you made and any possible implications from those decisions. This can include user stories for why the specific feature was added, thoughts behind refactoring you did, or even explaining your entire thought process on your changes. You should also link to the ticket or issue that your PR addresses to provide even more context to your reviewers. Lastly is the how. How are your reviewers supposed to test your code? You can provide all the details about what you changed and why, but your reviewers probably don't know the steps to actually reproduce your changes in a demo environment. Go through the steps of demoing your code changes and write each of those in a list for your reviewers. You want to be as explicit as possible. Provide direct links for the route they need to test and any feature flags or permissions they may need. You also want to make sure the exact scenarios you want tested are laid out. For example, certain steps your reviewers may need to show an error state. You want to detail the exact interaction that will need to happen. Here is a well-written description for an update to the Ember website. It's still a work in progress, so it's not totally ready to be reviewed, but it combines a lot of what we've been talking about. At the top is a link to the corresponding issue. Then the developer goes into a list of what exactly was implemented in the pull request and why those changes needed to happen. They dive even deeper by listing the remaining requirements that need to be addressed and provide additional notes to encourage feedback. And once this PR is ready to be taken out of a work in progress status and ready to be fully reviewed, the only thing that would make it even better is to add the exact testing steps reviewers can take to make sure that the language switcher is working as expected in a test environment. A way to enhance your pull request description even more is by adding a visual aspect. According to the Visual Teaching Alliance, visuals transmit information faster than spoken or written words. We can get a sense of the visual scene in less than 1/10 of a second, and visuals are processed 60,000 times faster in the brain than text. Think about when you're putting together a piece of furniture. There's written out instructions, but there's also visuals to help you. You actually see a picture of the base of furniture, along with diagrams of where you need to drill and add screws. We all poke fun at IKEA's drawings of how to put together furniture, but honestly, that's a lot easier to parse than complicated instructions being written out with no visuals of all the different parts. Adding a screenshot of the before and after of your changes and highlighting the differences can help your reviewers process your changes even faster. And you don't even need to download software to do this. You can simply take a screenshot on your Mac by pressing Command-Shift-4 and highlight the area where you want a screenshot. You're then able to use the markup feature to draw a square or circle around what you've added or changed. I like to often draw an arrow to kind of draw attention to it more and add a brief description on the screenshot itself. You can take this even a step further by recording your screen through something like QuickTime and actually walk your reviewers through your changes. This is great when your reviewers may not be as familiar with the area of the code base you're working on. You taking an extra 5 minutes to record a demo can save your reviewers 15 minutes of trying to get up to speed with what you're doing. And the thing I really love about recording a walkthrough is that your reviewers get to hear your voice and see a live demo. We're living in an asynchronous world, and those small things really make a difference in helping your reviewers fully understand what's going on in your pull request. Our PR is officially done now, right? Not exactly. Before adding any reviewers to my pull request, I become my own reviewer. I look through each of my commits to make sure they're linear and self-explanatory, and take a look through my code as well. During this process, I often catch simple mistakes, like a leftover console log. While doing this, I also annotate my own pull request. Have you ever been reading a book and left yourself notes in the margins? This is the same thing but for your reviewers. While reviewing your own changes, comment on specific lines of code that may leave your reviewers with questions. You can use this to explain why you chose to do something a particular way, like if the direction you decided to go was a little outside of the norm, or you can highlight a specific line of code to get more input on. Here's an example of doing this from a pull request for the Ember website. The author went through and commented on their pull request to clarify any areas where reviewers may have questions. This is going from the language switcher that we kind of talked about earlier. So they actually go into a bit more detail on why they implemented this translation as one line instead of translating each individual segment of the string. Further on in that pull request, the author explains why the additions they made to the package.json file were necessary. Pointing out these types of changes in your pull request are imperative, and doing so through commenting on your own PR helps shed even more light on them. Now that you've put together the story of your pull request, added your reviewers, and officially opened your PR, you would think that things end there. However, the conversation around your changes are only just beginning. The entire point of a pull request is to get eyes on your code so others can catch bugs or provide feedback. An essential part of the pull request process is responding to that feedback. Pull requests are a story, and you should be having conversations around that story with your reviewers. When receiving that feedback, you want to make sure that you're understanding the reviewer's perspective. They're commenting to learn more about what you've done and to help you grow as a developer. It's okay to get comments on your pull request, and you shouldn't view that as a negative thing or take it personally. Honestly, I take it more personally if I receive 0 comments on a PR. I want that feedback because it's pushing me to become a better developer and helping me think more outside of my box. If your reviewer makes a comment that you don't quite understand, then ask for clarification. However, pull requests are not the place to be debating about certain implementations. These conversations can easily get out of hand and overthrow the original objective of your PR, which is to get it reviewed and merged. If you catch that happening, take the conversation off of the pull request and into a face-to-face or virtual meeting. The important part of this is to update your pull request with any decisions that are made during that meeting. Again, you want to be completely transparent on your PRs. You want to make sure that the outcome of this meeting and any decisions are there for your reviewers to be able to be made aware of. Also remember that not all suggestions need to be implemented. Feel free to provide any clarification to reviewers on your decisions behind certain changes if they have questions. This is where becoming your own reviewer and annotating your own pull request ahead of time really comes in handy. By doing this, you're making it easier for your reviewers to understand your changes and eliminating the need for that back and forth that could happen. Whether you only get 1 or 2 comments or 10, you want to make sure that you reply to every single one. Pull requests should not be merged until every comment has been addressed, whether that's implementing a suggestion or not. If you do apply a suggestion from a reviewer, be sure to acknowledge that. Give it a thumbs up. Something I really love about GitHub and GitLab is that they both have a resolve comment feature in their pull requests. This allows you to let your reviewer know that you've acknowledged their suggestion, have put it into effect, and it's no longer a concern. By clicking that resolve comment button, or if that's not an option, simply liking their comment or replying with a thumbs up emoji, you're actually making it easier on both yourself and your reviewer to know that their comment has been addressed. Plus, this is a great way to keep track of what you have or have not yet gotten to in your pull request feedback. Not all comments will be within the scope of your pull request, though. Ultimately, it's your decision what is and is not within scope. But if something is outside of the scope, then you need to create a follow-up ticket. The key, as we've been saying to great pull requests, is being completely transparent. Explain to your reviewer why their suggestion is out of scope, and include the link to the follow-up ticket where it will be addressed. So, after all the comments are addressed, it's finally time. You get to push the merge button. You've accomplished your goal of merging your code to production, and that's another ticket marked off your to-do list. Now it's just time to start that process entirely over again with a new ticket. Thank you all so much for listening to my talk, and enjoy the rest of EmberConf.
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jai Bhagat, and I'm a UI engineer at HashiCorp. I work on the Nomad team. A quick fun fact about me is that I'm really new to web development. I I learned how to code about 3 years ago, and I have less than a year of experience with Ember. Um, and I think that's an important story to mention in the very beginning. Today, I am covering element modifiers under the hood. And what I think the purpose of this talk isn't to make you some expert overnight. Instead, my goal is I want to show you, as someone who's new to Ember, here's how I think through problems and what mental models I use to get myself unblocked. And I think that's a very important. It's a very important thing because when I first started developing, you know, things kind of started off and they were like a breeze at first. My tickets would be super well defined and they'd be like well scoped. Be like, hey, can you change the copy on this one view that we have? Could you give this component a makeover? Maybe we're kind of reordering the markup that we have. And I was doing great at that. But then when there was a bigger challenge, like, hey, can you render a template based on authorization, or could you implement a bunch of special requests, like maybe have this component render outside of the normal DOM tree, and then make sure that it it closes only when these events happen and not these events, and then I would get stuck. And basically, the issue was that if I had documentation or a tutorial, I could easily knock it out. But if it was anything beyond that, I would be stuck for a while. There's a lot of things that stump me on a pretty regular basis. I've inherited a code base of more than 70,000 lines of code that I didn't write, and the majority of it is still in the Ember Classic pattern. So if I need to upgrade to Octane, or I was up on Ember 3.20 up until maybe about 2 weeks ago. Now I've gotten to the latest version, but upgrading Ember or learning how to work with certain add-ons, those types of things were very difficult for me because I didn't have an understanding about how Ember was working. And not having that understanding meant that, that I would have to go to someone else for help. And I almost view it like there's this very big chasm between where someone like myself, a beginner product engineer, has to start solving bigger problems. And so I say this thing where, in today's world, it's never been easier to stand your application up. Like building your app and getting something working is super fast today. But maintaining the application itself, that's where a lot of the challenge occurs. And being able to maintain an application is where I don't think that there's a lot of resources. And this talk is supposed to go through my mental model of how I think through that. And as I think about crossing this chasm, or thinking about these situations where I'm starting to be attacked by things that I don't necessarily understand, I think about it very similar to like dragons that are attacking my city here. And when I think about dragons that are attacking my city, I think that I have a few options here. My first option is I can escape, which is the case of I can have one of my coworkers who are super knowledgeable come bail me out. That's one thing I can do. Another thing I can do is I can defend. I can choose to not upgrade any of these patterns that I'm seeing. I can just stick with the classic model. I can just stick with the pattern I see somewhere else in the code base. Or my third option is I can learn how to use my tools and master them so that I can attack these dragons. I think usually it makes sense to play defense. And I think a lot of times that's what we want to do because we know that there's a lot of business value to technical debt and the fact that it's working in production right now. So why bother breaking it? But one of the things is when dragons are attacking, and if all you do is immediately go into defense mode and you're not attacking them head on, those dragons just keep getting stronger. or in my case, technical debt continues to accrue. And now it may get to a size where I always need to ask someone else to bail me out, or it might even get to the size where the person that needs to come bail me out and is capable of bailing me out can no longer bail me out because the situation has gotten too bad. So that's why in this presentation, I'm really going to focus on, how do I think through these things as I'm learning how to tame these dragons? This is my way of thinking about things. By no way is this perfect. By no ways is this absolutely accurate. This is my system of thinking and how I solve the problems that I deal with on a regular basis. And some of it may not be absolute perfect to spec. So I just want to keep that in mind because, I'm a beginner and I'm a work in progress. But I think about things in 3 M's. So First, I want to understand the model of what I'm looking at. And so in the case of element modifiers, I think we want to go all the way up to Glimmer, be able to understand Glimmer just enough in context. The reason behind that is when I'm going through splunking, because I just got through a bug, I'm wondering where should I look? When I understand the boundaries of what something does and doesn't do, that tells me how far I should be looking. That tells me what keywords I should be using. So that's why we come all the way up to the model. Have a solid understanding of it, but know that you're not supposed to be an expert on this stuff. Next thing is the mystery, the actual element modifier itself. What can it do? What can it not do? What are some things behind the scenes that we don't see? What's that mystery piece? Once I understand that, again, that's going to tell me the boundaries of where I should be splunking. And then lastly, there's the actual method itself saying, hey, I have some business requirement. How does that, kind of compile down to what I know as a developer? What tools should I be looking out for? And that's going to be that last step there. So my intention and outcome for this talk, there's a 4th M word that I really just don't like, and it's the word magic. And, when I first started working in Ember, or even like in web development in general, if I tried to understand something that was beyond my level, everyone would just keep telling me that it was some magic. But the more you say the word magic, the more imposter syndrome I feel. Because if I can't understand the magic, but it seems like you're able to, the senior developer, it seems like you're a magician and I'm never going to be there. Like I'm just going to be someone in the crowd. So I do think that this is a word that I want people to stop using and to start explaining things in terms of JavaScript or in terms of what we know as developers so that it can be communicated in some way. Next, I want to bridge the gap between product and infrastructure engineers. I view product engineers as someone who gets, a set of user stories, they work with some business stakeholders, and they build an application. Infrastructure engineers are working with the APIs that we have, and they're thinking about, they think a little bit about how browsers work. They might think a little bit about how hardware works, and they definitely do think about how software fits into the mix here. Now, increasingly, I do think that crossing that chasm of being able to work with different dependencies, build tools, and all those other things that are going to help you become an intermediate to advanced developer requires you to start thinking like that. And you can't just have like that straight up product hat anymore. You have to think about how to solve some of those other issues, even if you're not incentivized to solve them. Otherwise, those dragons are going to keep getting bigger. And then my 3rd point is hopefully I can inspire and empower you to contribute to open source. Whether you're going to contribute to documentation or whether you're going to fix some low or high level bugs, I do think that if we're all using open source software, we should try to contribute in some way, shape, or form by helping with documentation, teaching, or contributing to the APIs themselves. So that's what my intentions and outcomes are. So let's get into it. We have our first dragon here, and our first dragon is Glimmer. So one of my biggest pet peeves when I was first learning Ember was that I kept seeing Glimmer when I was learning Ember. And when I asked about what Glimmer was, people said, don't worry about it. It's just magic. And that didn't help me at all because then I was stuck thinking, wondering whether my bug was related to Glimmer or not. So understanding Glimmer with first principles is important. I think about Glimmer with these first principles in mind. Number one, it compiles our templates into a JSON blob, and its goal is to reduce the over-the-wire size. I'll dive more into what that looks like when I cover what happens when we actually go to the browser. Number two, it's architected like a virtual machine, and it has two main subsystems that we want to keep track of. Number one are references, so anything that we're pointing to that isn't like a static value, it's a dynamic value. Number three, revision tags. These dynamic references, are they up to date or are they not up to date? And if they're not up to date, then we need to make sure that those values get recomputed. And then the third thing that we do is we render some DOM, right? So where we think about Glimmer is it's helping us go from this stage of we've fetched information from our website. Now we need to go paint what's on our screen. So, in our browser, we have this client server paradigm. I'll go to twitter.com. I'll ping the Twitter server by way of, just typing in twitter.com, which makes that request. Twitter.com sends us some information back. They can send us information back in a few different ways. One way, and the very popular way before single page applications came about, was sending back a string of HTML, which then gets parsed into a DOM tree and then painted onto the DOM. Now, a lot of front-end frameworks are sending JavaScript over the wire. But if we're sending JavaScript over, some string of HTML, now we have a very expensive parsing operation. So the beauty of what Glimmer is doing is it's finding that happy medium between, being able to parse that string of HTML or, interpret what that JS is by way of making sure that we're just getting this huge JSON blob, which drastically reduces that size and it's super easy to read. So this is where Glimmer is helping us out. I think it's pretty important to know what Glimmer is doing because now you feel confident about one part of the stack. Once you have confidence growing in one area, you start to have confidence that will build in other areas. So let's continue building out this mental model of what's going on in Glimmer. There's probably about 6 stages that I think about. Stage 1, where all of our handlebar files get compiled down in this pre-compile stage to this intermediate representation where we're going to start to form this abstract syntax tree of what our DOM is going to look like. It'll be validated to make sure that we're sending back, what will convert into a valid DOM later on. Then we'll have our build time compiler, which will then create that JSON blob that I was referring to earlier. And then we're going to have this module table where our template helpers and our element modifiers live that we're going to reference. And then lastly, we're going to paint our DOM, and whenever we have updates happening, we have this runtime compiler that will be making sure that we're triggering the correct operations. And that's about the extent that we need to understand about Glimmer with respect to beginner to intermediate level. Now that brings us into our next subject, which are element modifiers, right? So our element modifiers are Ember's way of giving us DOM manipulation rather than us manipulating the DOM on our own, which is something we probably don't want to do. We want to tap into Ember in order to do that. And using element modifiers, number one, we attach event handlers to our elements. Number two, we can fire callback functions that are associated to the life cycle of an element. I'll tie into how we're able to do that in the next slide. Number three, we're going to be able to manipulate element properties. So imagine I want to dynamically change the attributes of the elements that I'm working with. Number four, I may want to communicate with other elements inside or outside of the component that I'm working in by way of having a reference or being able to just attach an event listener to the entire DOM itself, which is what, I think some other Ember add-ons like Ember on outside click modifier, it's able to do something like that. In plain English, I think the big thing for beginners like myself is that if I want to do something that's JavaScripty inside of my template, I'll reach for an element modifier if I need to manipulate the attributes of an element dynamically, or if I need to fire off some side effect after, alongside my event on some type of input event, whether it be some mouse event or an input event like a key down or a keystroke. And then I'll use a template helper in the event I want to fire off some custom JavaScript logic that's going to yield out a property. Maybe, I want to display a property in its correct date format. I may be able to just use a quick template helper in order to do that. So that's what an element modifier is and the types of things that it helps us do. How are they created? So Ember has exposed this API for working with managers that we don't need to touch. This is the modifier manager. But I think the important thing to know is that we have this manager pattern, and the manager pattern is when we have an object that's responsible for coordinating the lifecycle events for its underlying property. And we have a lifecycle with element modifiers that we can tap into. We have its creation, so when it actually is being registered into our application. Once it's registered into our application, that allows us to tap into Ember's dependency injection system. Then there's when we actually invoke it or install it once that element is painted onto the DOM. There's what we do when any of the properties that we're relying on, so maybe arguments that we've passed into our element modifier update. And then, of course, if that element is being removed off from the DOM, we want to make sure to destroy any listeners we have and avoid any stale closure that we might run into. If we want to create our own modifier, Ember has released a high-level wrapper around that low-level API that I just talked about with the modifier manager and the modifier itself. So why don't we take a look at what that looks like right now? So at a glance, we see that we're importing from another module and there's a function, and we have this higher order function of a modifier. It's going to take a function as its parameter. And that function itself, this callback function that we see being executed here, that function itself has a function signature where it can take 3 inputs. The first input that it's guaranteed to take is the element that it's going to be attached to, based on whatever reference we currently have, which I think is very important to make sure that we're working with an element that's actually on the DOM. Next, we have positional arguments. So it's arguments that would be in a particular order that do not have a name. And then it could take a third optional parameter of named arguments that we may want to use later on. And then this function itself is also a higher order function in the sense that it returns out a function on its own. That function that it returns out is what will be fired once we hit the destroy part of the life cycle. So this is whenever we're planning to do some cleanup effect. And we want to do a cleanup effect in the event that we have some, something we're subscribing to. So we're subscribing to an event by way of an event listener. When it's time to tear down, we want to make sure to remove that so that we don't have those listeners just hanging around everywhere. All right, so that's like the quick way to understand that. So now we've just gotten through 2 of our big models here. First, we understand the model of where Glimmer fits into the mix. Now we understand when we want to reach for an element modifier, what API is going to help us use it, and the signature of the function that we're going to use to go ahead and create that API. So that's awesome. So now we have our final dragon. This is dealing with business requirements. This is usually the place where I normally want to give up because I can understand how things work, but then I have all this code that I need to deal with. And in this case, this is why you want to have a very strong understanding of the model and the mystery of the APIs that you're using, so you know what your best solution is going to be and how you can get to that optimal solution. So in our situation, we're going to try to create our own accessibility modifier. And there's a quick note that I want to make is that I am probably only 1 to 2 Google searches ahead of you on understanding accessibility. Up until this talk, I had only thought about accessibility as, enabling screen readers, and I was totally wrong. So there's two quick pieces that I want to share. So number one, sometimes the apps that we're making are going to end up turning into more of an obstacle for folks than a convenience for other people. And I do think that later on, you're going to see this amazing presentation from Zoe about space jamming accessibility. And you're going to be able to say, wow, this new website doesn't seem as if it's as convenient as the old version of this other website. And they'll walk you through why that's the case. So I think that's one important note to have. The other important note is that when we talk about accessibility, we're not just talking about, visual accessibility. Sometimes it can appear in motor and cognitive limitations as well. If you want to learn more, there's tons of resources at W3C. So you can go to w3.org/WAI, or you can click that full link right there. You'll see a full guide for developers, and you'll even see tutorials on how we create, certain very common UI elements that all come together. So the example we're going to work with today is going to be creating a more accessible drop-down menu. That's what we're going to try to create. So the way that I'm doing that as someone that's super new to development is I'm going to turn this into a user story. So as a user with motor limitations, I'd like the drop-down menu to stay visible long enough so that I can read and select the drop-down menu item. And an acceptance criteria that we have for this is that our drop-down menu should stay open for about 0.8 seconds. I don't know where I got that number from. Maybe I just picked it because it was a memorable number, to be honest, rather than 1. So now that is our user story. So let's get to our demo application now. All right. So I'm going to exit out of full screen, and here we have our demo app. And this demo app is made to be, just what a nav bar of like another Ember agency would look like. And so once we come over services, we see that there's a few other pages that show up underneath here. But the second I stop hovering over, this goes away, which I'm not fast enough to do that. Or, I might have a little bit of a shaky hand. So how can I do that? So now let's come over to our actual application. And one of the first things that we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to install Ember modifiers. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to kill this server first. And I'm killing it because once I add an Ember package, that's normally like a build time concern. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. Okay, so I'll say Ember install Ember modifier. And I'm pretty sure that is the case. It looks like we already have this installed, thankfully. I think I probably should hit that pause button real quick. All right, great. And so now my next move is I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new modifier. And so the way that I'll do that is I'll say Ember generate modifier, and I'll call this modifier hover. And so now let's think through our solution real quick. So I have, I have this property that when I hover over this, will start to show the list that's underneath it. And so it looks like, if I take a look at this CSS, that whenever we hover, we're going to show this property. Instead, we may want to turn that into some CSS class. So that's how I'm thinking about creating this modifier. And so let's come over here and let's write a quick modifier for ourselves. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add an event listener that will hook into our mouse over as well as our mouse out. And so I'm going to just use what we would see from W3C on how they would go ahead and solve an issue like this. So we're going to add this event listener, and this event listener is going to happen on mouse over, right? And now let's go ahead and let's create our callback here. And so we will add to our element class name. We're going to change this a little bit from has submenu to also have this open property. And then this will also mean that we need to change some of our CSS. We're also going to want to clear our timer. Amazing. And now we'll probably have this second element modifier here, or this event listener for what's going to happen on mouse out. Okay. And this will remove that name out for us so that we don't need to worry about it, but we're going to do that on a timer. So sweet. Now let's come over here. Let's get this actually into a timeout. Okay, set timeout. This will be some little function here. And we will do that every 800 seconds, or, every 0.8 seconds. This looks like this worked just fine. This probably just needs a semicolon. Or does it need a comma? Because that's over. Okay, sweet. This is probably just an issue with my linter yelling at me. And all right, sweet. And now let's make sure that when this function returns that we're removing these. So let's get two of these event listeners. So element.remove event listener. And let's do this first one on mouse over. And then of course we'll have this effect run. And then let's go ahead and do this once more on mouse out. Okay, sweet. And now let's just make sure that these, let's make sure to remove these. Okay. Okay, sweet. And I'm pretty sure if I just run yarn lint fix after saving this, that this file will look just fine. All right, amazing. And now we probably just have one more change to make here to make sure that we factor in for our open class. And now we'll add this into our template where it's needed. So we can add this modifier right into here. We just need to make sure that, that our element modifier has registered itself. Okay, it looks like this isn't registering just yet. Let's debug what the case of that could be. My first guess is that this is occurring because we just need to go ahead and rebuild. Let's give this a rebuild. Okay, yep, and all we needed to do was trigger that rebuild. So now we'll hover over here and we will move over, and we see that this is open for about a good second here. And so now there we have it. All it took was creating this element modifier right here, and then, using this directly in the element space that we have available. Now, of course, this could be refactored a little bit so that this could be more generic, that it can be a little bit dynamic as well. And I don't want you thinking that, oh my gosh, this was such a long walk for a short drink of water. Because although it does feel like it was a long walk for a short drink of water, what I do think is super important is that you need to be able to learn how to tame the dragon that you're dealing with. And so my system for going about doing that as a total Ember noob is being able to say, okay, well, if I have this business requirement, well, what things, how do I do X in Ember? So how do I fire a callback after the user takes some action in Ember? Well, now I know the answer to that is an element modifier. And if I go one step above that to say, okay, well, what's above an element modifier? And I start my understanding saying, what do I need to know about Glimmer that is in the context of an element modifier? Now, what do I need to know about element modifiers and how they work one level deeper than what I would do, maybe akin to what a library author would have to know? Then my job becomes a lot easier because now I know where to look to debug. I also know how to start dealing with some of the larger issues that I'm facing with. And instead of retreating or trying to escape the city, I still feel confident to attack that dragon, which allows me to feel like I'm beginning to master Ember, that I'm much more autonomous, and that I do have a greater sense of purpose. So hopefully that'll allow you to do the same. I want to leave you on one note here. And I said the same thing at EmberFest, which is when I was first getting started, learning was very difficult for me. And, I do notice that a lot of people do read the RFCs, and there is a very good RFC culture here, which is pretty amazing. But when you read to collect the dots. And then when you write out into the world, you're able to connect the dots. So I do think it's super important to make sure that, you're contributing back, whether it's a blog or a conference talk, to explain how you're thinking about these types of issues from your perspective, because it'll really help a beginner like myself. And then my last note here, again, my name is Jai Bhagat, UI engineer at HashiCorp. And one big thing that I'm really going to try to do over the course of the next year is create a free course on UI patterns for understanding Glimmer. And then hopefully eventually one day down the line, I'll have my own Ember course. But that's down the line. Thank you again, everyone. Appreciate everyone sticking through all the way to the tail end for this. All right. Have a good one.